Welcome to the Dark Hotel Room podcast, where the only problem with doing this in here and recording a podcast in a hotel room is that there is no light and it's so dark and it's just like dingy. And not to mention, they sprayed this like air freshener stuff in here. It's like making my eyes water and my nose is stuffing up. I don't know why people like the air freshener stuff so much, but into the boating content, we've got Larry here. He wants to know, is there a visible way to tell a 4-stroke from a 2-stroke? Which a lot of you out there are probably thinking, well, yeah, that's pretty simple, but it's, for some people, it might not be that simple. And yes, Larry, the simple answer is just look for a dipstick. If the engine has a dipstick on it, it's going to be a 4-stroke. And if it has an oil tank or a oil line on it, it's going to be a 2-stroke. Now, some of you might be thinking, oh, well, if it's got a remote fill on the outside, then it might be, that's another visible way of saying that you have a 2-stroke. But some people might repower their boats and not take out those fill ports on the back. So just be aware of that, thinking about it. But other than that, yeah, take the cowling off. If there is a dipstick, you have a 4-stroke. If it is got an oil tank on the side of the engine, you got yourself a 2-stroke. Simple, Larry. Everybody, thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing. This is going to be, like I said, the Hotel Podcast. It's going to be brought to you by you guys. Anybody that has joined the Boaters Program or our school community, which we just started that, kind of trying to figure out a good way to create a community within the community and be able to give more one-on-one with people. And I think school's going to be the way to do it. So in the description or the comment, there's going to be a link to that. And then also anybody that has purchased a shirt, thank you for supporting this program. Vindicator's question is, what's your opinion on roll-on trailers? So talking about trailers that have all the rollers on them, not necessarily bunks or boards. Seems like they have gone the way of the dinosaurs. My trailer has rollers and is old. My biggest problem is the leaf springs rusting like it's their job. Is there any way to prevent that or slow it down besides fresh water flushing? And I would love to get a new float-on trailer, but I'm not a rich man. Yeah, I think that roll-ons, there's still a few companies out there making roll-ons. I mean, I think roll-ons are really popular with like aluminum boats and stuff like that. I don't see a lot of roll-ons anymore. I'm sure there's a lot of companies still making them, but yeah, I guess I never really even thought about it as far as like, are there still a lot of roll-on trailers? I never really thought about it. I've seen tons of roll-ons, so I'm guessing that people still use them. I mean, they have their benefits opposed to the bunks, but at the same time, new float-on trailers are really nice too. So as far as the rusting goes, anybody that uses a boat and trailers it, this is a constant battle. And not just the leaf springs, everything else. The hubs, the axles, the bearings, the wheels themselves, the axles, well, not the axles, but the supports on the brackets, the trailer lights, all that stuff, the bunks rotting out, the little brackets to hold the bunks up, all that stuff rusts off very, very quickly. And there isn't really a good fix for that. The only thing I can think of that a lot of people do is use a dry silicone. So like you can get, there's CRC silicone, there's PB Blaster silicone, there's probably like a WD-40 type of silicone, like a dry silicone type of spray. You can spray that stuff on there or use any other kind of lubricant, something to get some oil or a lubricating element onto the metal. Anything that's going to protect the metal is going to be a good thing. I mean, even if you paint stuff, granted the leaf springs move so much that if you painted them, I don't know if that really is going to really help you as far as preventing rust. But the rest of the trailer, that's why most of them are galvanized, just because anything to combat the damaging effects of water, but not a whole lot outside of that. It's just part of taking a trailer and dunking it in water, especially salt water. It just happens so quick. And then a lot of places, a lot of ramps don't have water, so it's not like you can really hose off the trailer right there when you pull it out. So by the time you get to your house, if you're going 10, 15, 20, 30 minute drive from the ramp, the salt water that's on your trailer is already dried. The salt's on there. It's already starting to corrode and eat at the metal. So it's like, it's tough. It is tough. Richard Knott says, I can't see anybody in their right mind paying $195 an hour. It is a rich people's sport. honestly, 195 in a lot of places in South Florida is actually, that's like almost kind of standard. I want to say Marine Max last I saw was like at 245, and there are other marinas that are above 200 an hour. It is crazy that it has gone up that much. I mean, granted, 22% inflation over the last 3-4 years. So, printing $6 trillion, that's kind of what's going to happen when you do that. But I remember when I first started, we used to think it was expensive like over a decade ago when labor rate was like $85 an hour. Then it went up to like 110, then 145, and then 165, 185. Now it's like 195. It's just progressively gotten more and more and more. I'm sure there's places up north that are still like $100 an hour, but if you can find $100 an hour for a shop, that's really cheap. When you start thinking about everything that a shop has to pay for between insurance, taxes, the property, the equipment, the employees, the products that they purchase, like everything that goes into it, there ain't a whole lot left on that bone at $100 an hour unless you're a solopreneur. But yeah, price has gone up. Must Seat says, I noticed you used a block of wood for your transom saver. With all the different options out there for transom savers, it would be nice to see a video of the pros and cons of the various options, and if a cheap block of wood is just as good as an expensive transom saver someone can buy. The block of wood isn't really a transom. It's funny because they call them transom savers. So any one of the things that you put on the engine, like on your tilt and trim unit or the block of wood or any of the stuff, don't use the little kickstand. Most engines have a kickstand on them. Don't use that if you're transporting your boat because it's going to snap off. Just the weight and here's your engine, and when you trim it up, that engine like this, if you got that little leg there, it's going to snap it right off. So don't trailer with that leg, but that's for like servicing and stuff like that. But a transom saver, the ones that go on the trim unit aren't really transom savers. It does do something. So like if you put a block of wood in there, or you put one of those rods onto your trim unit, onto the ram, and then trim it down so it's resting on that does take, because you've pulled the engine down and it's like wedged in there. So it kind of makes it one unit, opposed to when it's trimmed up, the end is flexing like this, putting a lot of flex on your transom, which creates stress cracks and other things in the transom. So it is kind of a transom saver, but it's still, when you put it down, you pull it down, it's locked in. Like you've got the wood, you've got your rod there, whatever, the trim unit is pulling it in. So it is locked in. So it's not as much of a flex on the transom, but really a real transom saver is going to be the ones that go down to the trailer, from your lower unit down to the trailer. So that way, as the boat goes up and down, that thing kind of absorbs the shock and like keeps the transom and the engine together, which takes that stress off of the transom, which is where you get, like, if you look in the back of a transom where it curls out, like depending on how your boat is, most of them have a splash well or a wet well or a cutaway transom, whatever you got on your boat, and you look at the corners there, you'll start to see stress cracks, and that's what a lot of that is from, especially on a trailered boat, because in the water, the boat in the water kind of like everything kind of flexes and takes a lot of stress off. But whenever you are going down the road and the thing's on a trailer, it's got a lot of that weight. There's no flex there. It doesn't have the water to like cushion it. It is the boat and the engine, and it's just pulling on your transom. So it's got a lot more torque on there. It gives you stress cracks. They're really not expensive though. I don't know, what you're talking about here with an expensive transom saver. Most of them are, you can get on eBay and get a decent transom saver for 30, 40, 50 bucks. They're not, I guess when you're talking about a 2x4 that you stick in the engine, which, whatever, $5 or whatever, compared to a $40 transom saver, yeah, I guess it would be expensive. But in all honesty, that's kind of something that you buy at once, and then you've got that thing for years. As far as the different options, that's kind of what you got. You really have the ones that go to the trailer, and then everything else. Block of wood, the little rods that stick on the trim rams, those are kind of like that's it. That's really your only options. I don't know if there's anything outside of those that give you, as a transom saver. Mules and Mustangs says, any idea about a 3.3 liter Yamaha 225 or 250 overheating at idle RPM? Good pressure at 4,000 and putting around, let idle for 5 minutes and the buzzer goes off. Telltale has a good stream. Seems like it used to be a little stronger at idle. New impeller too. So one, thermostat, make sure your thermostat's good. Number 2, make sure the pop valve isn't messed up. And then number 3, on a 3.3 liter Yamaha, it really isn't going to be that good of news because you might have a midsection problem, and at idle your water is going up and then dumping into the exhaust and you're losing cooling water at idle, whereas at 4,000 RPM, you have enough volume and enough flow to still fill the power head and get rid of any kind of overheat. It cools the engine down. But on those models, unfortunately, there is a midsection issue there. I mean, this is an older engine. Now we're talking about a 20-year-old engine, but a low idle overheat on a 3.3 liter Yamaha, most likely, if it's not thermostat pop valve and not the impeller, then outside of the water tube, most likely you've gotten a midsection that is starting to go. Depending on how early it is and how bad it is, you might be able to pull your power head, get in there, and if you can see the pitting, usually the pitting is right there at the top. Sometimes you can get in there and JB weld that a little bit and kind of like buy yourself some time, but honestly, it's not really a good thing, and it's not really a cheap thing. So unfortunately, the bearer of bad news is going to be that. I don't know if that's really your problem. You got to look at the other things first, but yeah, unfortunately, that is one of the scenarios that could be happening. AG Co says, question, bought a used boat. It has a Lumar windlass, an auto bilge, and a fusion stereo, among other things. When the windlass slips a smidge, I click it back in. It turns the stereo and the bilge on. Any idea what is going on? Something's not wired up right. That's what's going on. So if you think about how things are wired, especially in a boat, anybody could have been in there wiring something up. And for your windlass, you've got power that goes to the windlass, usually through a big breaker and a switch, and that's the main power that powers the windlass. Then you've got the control side of the windlass, which is usually done by a small relay, or they're built in together where you've got the control side of the relay that feeds the high power, the high amperage power feeding the windlass for it to work, and then the low amperage power that controls that relay to move that switch. Different windlasses have different relay systems, but virtually all of them, unless you have a smaller one, and a really old one and a smaller windlass, some of them do not use a control relay. It's just straight up through the switch, which, that's neither here nor there. We're not even going to get into that conversation. But outside of those, most windlasses have a control side and a power side to them. So if you are hitting your buttons for the control side of that relay and it is activating your stereo and your bilge pump, then somewhere the power that feeds your stereo and your bilge pump is tied into that relay system somehow. So whenever you activate your windlass, it's powering to control that relay, but it's also letting power feed through something. It could be anything that is doing this. The power could be getting over there 100 different ways. There's not like I could be like, oh yeah, it's the red wire that comes from this side of your boat and it goes down here. I can't do that. But you definitely need to just follow the wires that go from your buttons on to your actuator, your windlass. Follow those, and you're going to find them tied in somewhere to the other items that are giving power to your radio and to your bilge pump. You've had somebody in there doing some wiring, or you could have a rat in there. There's a million different reasons why this is going to happen, but it honestly sounds like you're about ready to rewire your boat. That might be what you might need, a rewire. Unfortunately, you just bought the boat, so that's not a good thing, but neither is your bilge pump and your stereo being controlled or getting power when you use your windlass. That's a different one. I have not heard that one before. Snook Guy says, where did the power supply connection come from that you attached to the Lenco switch you installed? So, okay, this is similar. So trim tab systems are similar. Lencos are a little bit different because they don't use necessarily a relay system. Like if you got a Bennett or something else, they're similar to the windlass in the aspect of a hydraulic trim tab system has relays on it that use same thing. You have high amperage or high power that controls the actuators that make the trim go up and down. And then you have low power or low amperage, low amperage wires that are smaller that control a relay that controls that. Lincos generally go through one single box. They're electric, they're not hydraulic, they don't require as much power. So usually they have two different things. One is the power that powers on, like that gives power to move the actuators. And then the other one is I guess you'd call it a wake up or a live or a key on power type thing. Lenco, normally it's orange, and this one usually gets tied to your key switch. So that way when you turn your key switch on, boom, you got power to your trim tab systems. So now your trim tabs will operate, and most Lencos have an automatic retract feature, which means when you turn the key switch off, that auto retracts your trim tabs. So, if you trailer your boat and your bunks go where the trim tabs are, or if you dry stack your boat and it gets pulled out of the water by a forklift or something like that, then if your trim tabs are left down and they hit the bunks or the forks of a forklift, pick it up, it will snap your trim tabs off or break the actuator or multiple different things. It's going to cause damage. So whenever you turn the key switch off, that auto retract, if you left them down and you didn't have them all the way up, it automatically retracts them up into the boat. So you avoid damaging your trim tabs by forgetting them down and it being picked up or trailered onto a trailer. So that's usually what that power is a key on power. If you got Suzuki, you got Yamaha, you got Mercury, different colors are different, but it's usually key switch power. So all of the brands have a key on power line. Mercury's purple, Yamaha's yellow. It's just, you tie into that. So when you turn the key on, boom, you get power. When you turn the key off, auto retract, done. In Austin Hall says, if you could only become certified in one brand, what would be the best one to try and get into? Also, what does the certification and master tech certification process look like? Totally depends on you, Austin. Totally depends on you. For me personally, I'm at the point where it's not really that big of a deal for certification for me. But if you're getting into it and you want to make it a long-term thing and get your master tech, then pick one that you like. Like if you like Yamahas, then go for Yamaha. If you like Mercury's, go for Mercury. Suzuki, go for Suzuki. If you do not like Yamahas or you do not like Mercury's, then don't go for that one. I would say that number one. Like if you're a Mercury guy and you don't like Yamahas, don't get on the Yamaha certification path because you don't like it. You're not going to enjoy it. You're going to be complaining the whole time. Like no one wants that. Same thing vice versa. If you only like Suzuki's and you don't like Mercury's, then don't go on the Mercury path. Like unless you want to change your thinking and actually just work on engines. But also I would say depends on where you live and what's around you. Because the main thing for certifications in a master tech is that you want credibility to work on stuff and then also to work on stuff. Like, so wherever you are, if you are in an area that has a lot of Hondas, I would go for Hondas. If you're in an area with a lot of Yamahas, go for Yamahas. I wouldn't go for something that you don't have. Like, getting into a Mercury dealer where there's only 3 Mercuries in town and the rest are all dominated by Hondas, like getting your Mercury certification, there's not really any work for you to work on them. So like that one doesn't make really sense. And then your master tech so as far as which one I would pick the one that you like and the one that you have an abundant of engines to work on to keep yourself making money. As far as the master tech stuff goes, that one, every process is different depending on which one you go for. They're kind of similar. Most of them, you think about a master tech, most of the brands want you to know their product. So like you have to there's a path. So that makes you do like, Mercury, you have to know OptiMaxes, you have to know Verados, you have to know SmartCraft networks, you have to know the, V6, V8 lines. Like you have to know the product, and then after I think it's 3 years, you are eligible to take the master tech as long as you take all the other courses. So for like Yamaha, there's 6 different courses that you have to take. Once you pass all those, then you're eligible to go take your master tech, and then you take it until you get it. So everyone's kind of similar. You have to take let's say 6 courses. And then once you pass those, then you can take a Master Tech test. And then once you pass it, then boom, you're in. But that's kind of that. The cable guy says, did you see the information about the lithium batteries in your instructions with your Minn Kota Terrova? I seen something about it in the instructions, but I haven't read it yet. I will be using gel batteries with mine. So here's what it actually says for the Minn Kota thing. There's 2 different ones, and there's a very subtle difference between the 2, but we're going to talk about this. Minn Kota trolling motors, this comes from Minn Kota, and this is actually off of, an Ultra or an Alternator or a Terrova, depending on which year you got it, and then compared to another model. But it says Minn Kota trolling motors can run on lithium-ion batteries. However, they're specifically designed to run on traditional lead-acid batteries, flooded AGM or gel. Lithium-ion batteries maintain higher voltages for longer periods of time than lead-acid. Therefore, running a Minn Kota trolling motor at speeds higher than 85% for a prolonged period can cause permanent damage to the motor. And then in a later model, it says Quest series motors will operate with any deep cycle marine 12, 24, or 36 volt batteries and have been optimized for use with Life PO4 lithium ion battery cells. Lithium ion batteries maintain higher voltages for more extended periods than lead acid batteries and will provide the best performance in powering the trolling motor. So you notice 2 different statements, and the big thing is that the one says Quest, so really it comes down to kind of a brushless versus brushed trolling motor. That's kind of like the issue here, and all it is really saying, like it says, Minn Kota trolling motors can run on a lithium-ion battery. However, they're specifically designed to run on traditional lead-acid batteries, being this model is a brushed model. So if you put a lead-acid battery on there and then you go out there and run it wide open throttle, it will most likely prematurely wear out the brushes because a lead-acid battery drains progressively. So once you get down to 80, 75, 60, 50% on a lead acid battery, you are not getting near the same amount of power as you get at 100%. So what I'm trying to say is you get progressively less power from the normal battery than you do a lithium. A lithium is going to put out the same amount of power at 100%, at 50%, at 40%, 30%, depending on the BMS. And the quality of the battery, but it's going to get as much power as it has rated for. It's going to give that all the time. So therefore, I guess the thinking is, again, I'm not a lawyer or anything like that, and I don't work for Minn Kota. So, this is my opinion on my interpretation of what they're saying here and why this is like this. So that way you can kind of understand what's going on here. But it says Minn Kota trolling motor at speeds higher than 85% for a prolonged period could cause permanent damage to the motor. Meaning, if you go out there and you run that trolling motor wide open throttle at 100% power until the battery's dead, and you do that consecutively, you're gonna prematurely wear out the brushes that are in the trolling motor. But, again, that's why it says they can be used with a lithium ion, because most people aren't just out there full blast for the entirety of however long their lithium ion battery lasts. Like if you're out there at 100%, that thing's at 10 redlined, and you're just sitting in a current and it's barely holding the boat there, and you've got it wide open throttle for that long. Like, I can't say who, but a lot of people don't use the trolling motors like that. Normally you're using it to run a weed line. You got it at like 3 or 4, or depending on the current, it changes, because otherwise you're just driving around with the trolling motor for enjoyment, I guess. But then when we're talking about the Quest is a brushless trolling motor. So brushless, there's no brushes for it to wear out. That's why there's 2 different statements here, because the newer models or a brushless model, it doesn't matter. You run 100% all the time if you want to, but there's no brushes for it to wear out. So that's kind of like my interpretation of that. I'm sure there's other people out there that have a different interpretation of that, but from what I can read and from understanding it from the brushed versus the brushless and the lithium versus the lead acid, like that's kind of the gist of what's going on there, is that, if you go out there and prematurely wear out your trolling motor within 6 months, that's kind of the deal there. Rudy says, this video is gold. I have one question. How do you make sure that the stator or alternator senses the battery? Is the ground wire coming back from the battery? I have twin Yamaha HPDI and I'm rewiring it because now they share 2 batteries. I want to put each motor on their own battery. I'm trying to think about how you're wording this and what you're really trying to do. I mean, like, you got 2 different engines, and where's the question here? You got 2 engines and 2 batteries, and they're probably linked with a battery switch, probably 2 battery switches. So you'll have your engine, a battery switch, and a battery. So there's those 3 items. And then you'll have your battery switches wired up to where, this one, number 1 is 1, number 2 is 2. And then this one, number 1 is 1 and number 2 is 2. So that way you can switch between the 2 and use, like, if you're trying to charge one or charge the other, or like, you can mess around with that because you link them with your battery switches. But as far as like it charging and sensing it, yeah, the engine senses whatever battery it's hooked up to, and it charges based on that battery. So like, it sees your engine is hooked to the battery and the battery is hooked to the engine. So the engine's computer sees how much voltage is in that battery, and then the stator is sensing that power there. So if it sees 11.7, it's going to try and charge it up. And then if it sees, 13 volts, it's not going to charge it up. It's going to send the voltage to ground. So rectifier, regulator, alternator, you kind of got different things there. But I think I'm misreading your question or not understanding it. It's going to sense it. And your batteries have to be linked. You have to ground them together. But other than that, I think I'm missing your question. Mike Williams says, I have a large 2-stroke that I've been pre-mixing for several years. I am upgrading to a new to me Suzuki 4-stroke. Is there a ratio of premixed oil that can be safely left in the tank by diluting with fresh gas, or does all the oiled gas need to be removed with the install of the 4-stroke to keep from harming the engine? I mean, I guess it depends on how much oil are we really talking about here. I'm trying to think of a very general way of answering this question, because realistically, think about it. You're running oil into the engine. You're running it through your fuel system, so your fuel pumps, through your VST, your FSM, whatever you got, a Suzuki, a VST, and then you've got your injectors. So it's running all that oil through it. I mean, unless you got some dirt in there, it's just oil. The fresh fuel is going to wash the oil away. It's just going to burn it. It's going to be smoky. A little bit of oil is probably not going to hurt on break-in. So, I mean, it depends on how much oil we're talking about and how much are we talking about. We talking about 300 gallons of heavily mixed 2-stroke oil. That probably wouldn't be the best to run straight through your engine, but at the same time, it's just going to be smoky and it's kind of oily. If it's not much in there, like if you've got, say, 20 gallons of mixed fuel, then yeah, just fill the thing up with fuel. That'll kind of dilute it, and then it'll burn through. It's going to be smoky. You're going to have smoke coming out your engine until you burn all that out. But as far as damaging it, it's not really going to damage it. I think you're going to be fine there. Again, depending on how much oil we're talking about and what's the quality of the oil. But Michael says, hi Aaron, can you explain if the alternator on a Mercury 4-stroke 300 horsepower can be connected to sense different battery banks with a swappable bank setup, i.e. each battery bank is swappable and isolated manually by a main switch, no ACR or battery isolator? Does the alternator sense the voltage and thus regulates output, A, via the clean power harness permanently connected to bank 1, or B, via the battery cables which are swapped between banks 1 and 2? I am asking because I am not sure if battery bank 2 is actually being sensed or charged. Thanks. Okay, so take the clean power out of it. Clean power you have to have. So you have to have clean power. It's going to go to one battery. It goes straight to the engine, but that has nothing to do with the charge side or the power consumption of the engine. The clean power, all that does is supply power for the computers in the system to work. So like your PCM on the engine and the CCM that's in the helm, computer in the helm, computer on the engine, those all get power. And the power that it gets is the clean power, and it uses that clean power to be on, so that way, if you have battery spikes, other stuff, it's kind of like protecting the computer from anything that could be going on with the engine, starter, stuff like that, high amp draws, voltage spikes, anything like that. Clean power is separate from that. Now, when it comes to charging the batteries, the engine is just going to be whatever battery it's being fed from. So if back to kind of what we were talking about earlier with the batteries, let's take the second engine out of the scenario, and you've got two batteries here. You got one engine. The engine is going to be hooked up to the battery. You've got a switch here. The switch is between this battery and this battery. So you're manually switching between whichever battery is there. Whichever battery that switch is on, that's the battery that the engine is getting power from. The power that it gets from there, the alternator is seeing that. So usually the PCM is going to be saying, hey, we've got 12.4 volts, and the alternator is going to be sensing that 12.4. So it's going to be charging that, and then once it gets to a certain spot, it's going to stop charging that and send it to ground. The batteries need to be grounded together, but whichever battery is selected and powering the engine, that's the battery it's going to sense, and that's the battery it's going to be powering. There is no other way outside of using an ACR to regulate that. Like if you use an ACR, then the ACR is what is selecting the battery to be charged from. But no matter what, that's because you separate them. So like most modern engines, especially 300 horsepower, like if you got a Yamaha, you got a Mercury, whatever you got, most of them have an isolation circuit, meaning that you have the power that goes to the engine, but you can also isolate or take the charge power from your alternator and run that to a separate spot. And that separate spot, they can then go to the ACR, and then the ACR decides which battery gets charged based on the state of charge of that battery. So your ACR is basically distributing that power. The alternator is going to be sensing the power that is going from the battery. So there's the only kind of difference there, is that whatever battery is feeding the engine, that's the battery, or that's what the alternator is using to determine how much power to put out and for how long to put it out. I don't know if that's really, if I made that understandable. John Coleman says, do they really make V4 outboards, or are they I4s or L4s? As a hobby mechanic for 28 years, that has always been a cringe word for me. The L4s or the I4s, I guess, that's kind of cringe, because really it's an I4, it's an inline 4 or an inline 6, and then your V4 or V6 or V8. But yeah, they make V4s and inline 4s for sure. Like old two-strokes, most of the old two-strokes, 115s, 130s, 90s, a lot of those were a V4, which is, it's a V4, it's a V engine. And then now most of the 150s, 200s, 4 cylinders are all inline, which is an I4. But if we're talking about Mercury, everybody calls it an L6 for an inline 6. So yeah, I feel you there to a point. It's funny because you start saying all these different things, and it's like, what are you really talking about? Depending on who you're talking about, how are they using a word? What are you really saying? Because they might be using something that they don't really know what they're saying, and kind of hard to decipher sometimes, but that's just what it be. NWRX says, with muffs on engine running, is the lower end unit supposed to get warm like hot? Would that be normal? Back to using words, it depends on how hot are we talking about. What is hot? What are you saying? Like, if you think about the lower unit, your exhaust comes down out of the engine, and your exhaust is going to be hot. It's the bypass, it's fire, is heat, it's the exhaust. So it's going to be hot. That comes out through the exhaust, it comes out through the prop. So with the engine on the muffs, you're only getting that water to cool it, but the exhaust is coming out of there, so it's going to be heating it up. Like if you look at older two-strokes, older Johns and stuff like that, you'll notice the paint's melted on some of them, and it's all black, and you can tell a discoloration on the lower units and the drive shaft housing coming down from the exhaust, making it hot. So depending on what we're saying here, if you're saying hot, you got frictions in your gears and things, the lower units getting you've got a heat problem, then no, that wouldn't be good. But yeah, it's gonna get warm. I don't know about hot, so I'm gonna say that's normal depending on what we're talking about here. But yeah, I'm gonna say it's normal. And last question, we're gonna go with Boater's Hub. He says, "Hey Aaron, hello Boater's Hub. How about fixing a dinged up propeller? Not much info on props." Yeah, props are really, I don't really do a lot of fixing like that. I mean, it depends on what kind of ding we're talking about here. Like if it's just bent and you can bend it back, that's really, the highest I go. But if you got a chip out of it, then, it needs to be welded and then ground back down. And depending on how expensive or how nice this prop is, then is it worth really doing that or just replacing the prop? And then also depending on, the bend or whatnot, like if it's all jacked up, like an unbalanced prop can cause you problems. So like if you have an unbalanced prop, like let's say you got a ding or a bend over here, like if one ear is bent, it's going to create a vibration that can cause you problems. It can mess up your prop shaft seals. It can create a vibration in the engine. You can have problems created from a unbalanced or a bent propeller. So really, as far as fixing them, like I'll bend them back and kind of get them pretty close. But if there's chips and stuff out of it, then on that one, you got to take it to a prop shop that then welds it and then grinds it down and then balances it. So like, they balance them. So there's not a whole lot you can do depending on how bad the prop is.